Hey Brady, I saw the
big picture. So yes, you will need to be able to report them. Yes, there will be some questions about ones that you have the ability to handle or do something with away. But anything else where you would have to go investigate why the assumption was violated or what made it happen, you can't do that without raw data. So I'm not gonna ask, well, what would you do? Because the answer would be, it depends. So just a quick note about assumptions there. Graphical interpretation and creation. So what I mean by that is we've looked at examples of main effects, of interactions. You should be able to both interpret those and also generate those. So we have a couple of questions and examples of those in today's deck. Some ANOVA basics, but not really like explicit questions about it. More like you kind of just got to understand it to know what's happening in ANOVA, but I'm not going to ask you, like, there's no sums of squares table. There's no, like, that sort of really basic stuff. There's no, like, what does mean squares mean? It means variance. We're past that. Like that kind of basic stuff, not explicit questions on it. Biggest thing is like, can you look at a study that uses ANOVA and like make sense of it? So analyzing main effects and interactions, including post-hocs and simple effects, effect size, reporting APA, lay, using output and visualization, and then using output to answer specific questions beyond simple reporting. So what I mean by that is exactly what we practiced in the interaction activity, where it was like, what would happen if this group weren't here? Or what about specifically just people who are anti-mascot? So being able to answer specific questions from the output rather than just the step-by-step. Like there's no, I'm not making a whole APA manuscript on the exam. That would not be a good use of time. But you should feel comfortable finding information that you need to be able to answer the question. Well, questions about the questions.
Is it helpful to have scratch paper at all?
100%. Yeah, you should definitely have scratch paper because you're going to want to be able to have your research question and your means tables no matter what, probably like next to you. Even if you're just drawing means tables that have X's in it, that will help. Even if it's a non-value question. Some high level stuff before we do questions. So first of all, designing research, we essentially have kind of two blocks. We have one-way ANOVAs and we have factorial ANOVAs. One way implies just one predictor. We have two types, really. We have one way between groups and one way repeated measures. They're both one way. They just get simplified usually to say a one-way ANOVA implies between groups. An RM ANOVA implies repeated measures because nobody wants to say the whole thing. That's a common thing that happens in stats is we shorthand. What's interesting about it is that it is entirely dependent on study design. It has nothing to do with the research question itself or the test. It has to do with study design. So one of the questions that got asked twice on the review on the Qualtrics was, in the practice, the study design was between group experimental design. And a lot of people wrote between group factorial design. That's not wrong. But experimental is the study is one of the features of study design. Factorial would be fine too. They're just answering different questions. Factorial tells me that it's a two predictor design. Experimental tells me it's a true experiment. They're answering different elements of the design. Does that make sense? If you wanted to say the whole thing, you could be like factorial, it's a experimental design and factorial. It's like the difference between the analysis and the design of a study. Well, not something you need to know in the context of this. You're not wrong though if you wrote factorial. All right, so if we're looking at a research question like what is the effect of feedback source on performance, these are all iterations of the same question and they can all be answered with either a between group or a repeated measures ANOVA, depending on how you want to design it. The same thing happens in a factorial, whether it be a purely between group factorial design or a mixed factorial design. It can be the same question sometimes, not always. It would be very silly to do a pre, during, and post design with different people, but it can be really silly. But oftentimes, like in this particular example, you could run this as either a mixed factorial, in which case each person receives one of the three types of feedback, positive, negative, or neutral, but they receive it under three different conditions. They don't get it after a task, they get it from a peer after a task, and they get it from a supervisor after a task. In this design, which is purely between group, everybody in each condition is totally different. You can't tell the design from the research question. You can't tell the design from the research question. That only comes after you've designed and hypothesized. Now, if you have a time variable, you could probably infer that maybe one of the variables is repeated measure, but probably not. The key here is that we can always just say, how does predictor 1 and how does predictor 2 impact outcome? But when we're talking about a factorial or a mixed factorial, what we're really interested in is the interaction, which means what we really want to do is design our research question with the word depends. So making sure we pick one of those predictors to be the depends variable. How do you pick it? I can't give you a rule. Why? Because I don't know what you care about as a researcher. It completely depends on what you care about as a researcher. Now, when we get to simple effects, I will show you some thinking about how to split it. However, in the output, hint, hint, it's already split. I'm not going to ask you to split on the exam, but I do, for the purpose of research, like you thinking about, well, what would answer my question? That's a good, I got a lot of that question. That's a good question. So I'm not going to, for that one, I'm not going to play the, it's not on the test game because it's a great research question.
Yeah, so the output will include both split.
Not necessarily.
So does that mean that you can infer from the way that the output is split to like?
You answer that question. I'm either going to provide you with both or one of them. And if I provide you with one of them, you should be able to look at the means table and be like, this is how it was split. Test ID. One very small reminder. We did really well with this on the midterm, but really quickly, just make sure you're specific about your test, especially now that we have 4 types of ANOVA. So if you say factorial ANOVA, I'm with that. You don't, if you want to be really specific and thorough, you could say between group factorial ANOVA. That would be like, really, I know you know it, versus mixed factorial ANOVA. That's how we would because they're both factorial ANOVAs. One-way ANOVA, if you want to be really thorough, you could say one-way between groups ANOVA, but I'm fine with one-way. Repeated measures ANOVA, that's enough. You could say one-way repeated measures ANOVA, but questions about that part? So when you are doing that, if you are someone who struggled at all with test identification, make sure you have these 3 questions jotted somewhere and that you go through them in step by step when you are answering the question. How many independent variables? Now we have an option of 1 or 2. 1 would be the regular one-way ANOVAs versus 2 factorials. Are they measured between or within? Now we have 3 options. It could be between, all within, or mixed. And then how many levels? How many levels comes in where? Where does that question matter? There's 2 places it matters, but actually really 1 place. I just heard it. Simple effects. That's where you have to decide what type of analysis to run. You don't have to decide what type of analysis to run with ANOVA or post-hocs. It does the whole thing. Where you have to decide and specify is in simple effects. Am I going to run t-tests? Am I going to run ANOVAs? Yeah. I'm going to skip IDs for now. I'll write them and then because we're going to do so much writing on this, I will upload this annotated deck after I'm done because we're going to draw a bunch of stuff later on in the deck. All right, partitioning variance. This you should feel good about. I feel like we've gotten pretty good at this. The most important thing is to remember, I would say high level, a couple of things. When do we decide to split by within and between, and when do we not? And the very simple answer to that question is, if there is a within component in your model, I have to say it again, if there is a within component inside your model, then you need to split by within and between first. As in, are any of your predictors measured within subject? So let's start with the one-way ANOVA. Model is performance regressed on feedback source. So we don't have to deal with within. What's the only source of within? Error. When all the variables are between subject, then the only within source is error. So error can always hang out by itself. It can always be just model and error when everything is between. So we've got model and not model. Model, not model. In this case, model is the same thing as whatever our treatment is. And it's between because it's our between subject predictor, and error is our within subject predictor. Question at all about partitioning in a one-way? I feel pretty good about this. Yeah, pictures like.
I sometimes have a little bit of confusion knowing when to say between subject, between group, between person.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would stick to so when you're talking about how a variable is measured, I would stick to between subject or between subject and between person are the same thing. Subject and person are synonyms of each other. Subject is just more formal than person. It's like saying between peeps or within peeps. It's the same thing. Like we're just using a more formal term. Within group or between group refers to when you're talking not about how the individual variable is measured necessarily, but about when we get to the F stat, which variance we're talking about. The spread between the groups or the spread within the whole group. When you're talking about how a variable is measured, then we refer to it as between subject, within subject. Yeah, good? That help clarify? Good. Keep the questions coming. Otherwise, I'm just re-explaining partitioning variance again. So otherwise, ask questions when it doesn't make sense. We're gonna go factorial. I'm gonna go from one way to factorial. Why? Because they're both, everything that we care about in the model is between, which means what is the only source of within? Error. So look over here, in a one way, we split it away from total into model and error. We do the same thing here in a factorial. We split it away, model and error. What's the only difference? Instead of having one thing in my model, I've got 1, 2, 3 things in my model. So that model just has 3 pieces. That's it. Yeah. So in some ways, the partitioning of variance, if you're trying to remember like systematic and between, the one way and the factorial ANOVA are actually more similar than anything else. Because it just goes model, error, and then how many pieces are in the model. That's it. Questions at all about those two?
Hey, Jess, could I just ask a question about power within, like,
Yeah.
so when it comes
Go ahead.
so when it comes to, so I think the question I want to ask is when you're running studies and things like that, because it seems to me like, especially with factorial and multifactorial, especially like when we were looking at DA6, like you got so much of your variance that was explained by your different conditions that in my mind, like, why wouldn't you run a study in a factorial, more multifactorial design versus just a simple
Mixed factorial?
Oh yeah, sorry, mixed factorial, thank you. Instead of just a one-way ANOVA, like would it not just, you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yes, except in that, so look, yay, it's on there, just a sec.
Amazing.
Give me one there, give me 2 slides. It's a good question.
Got it.
Now let's go to the 2 types of ANOVA we've learned that have a within subject variable, or a synonymous, Victor, a repeated measure variable. We can say that too. Essentially one of the variables, one or the only variable or one of the variables has been measured amongst the same people multiple times. So in this case, we don't partition model and error. Why? What would be the problem if we went model? We could. Here's the thing, we could. What would be under, if we went model and error, what would be under model for an RM ANOVA? What would it be in this exact example? Performance. If we started with
Within.
sums of squares of performance and we split it into sums of squares model and sums of squares error, what would happen? What would we run into now? This would be easy. What's in the model? What is it? Literally in context. Feedback source. And it's within, because it's a repeated measure. So like 2 layers, kind of redundant, but not wrong. What do we run into on the other side though? No. What is the problem here? Good. If normally error is within, and it is within, but what am I missing here? Yeah. The error, what does R call error? And what do we sometimes call error? It's what's left over from our model. What's actually left over from our model that's inside here? This leftover part actually has 2 pieces. What are they? Between subject differences and real unexplained error. Those are both residuals. They're left over from our model. Remember that the whole goal is to explain differences in performance, variances in performance. We want to explain as much variance in performance with feedback source as we can. Any variance we can't explain is a residual. It's left over. But because this is a repeated measures ANOVA, we don't have to chalk all of that up to error. We actually know one of the other reasons. It's stable differences between subjects. So if I tried to split it like this, well then that error term, first of all, isn't true error. I would have, you know what I would call it? If I really wanted to split it this way, I'll show you what I'd call it. If I wanted to split it model error, I wouldn't call it error. What would I call it? Yeah. I would say, here's sums of squares total. Here's sums of squares model. Here's sums of squares residuals. That gets split into true sums of squares error and sums of squares subject. That would be another way of conceptualizing. If you like always saying, hey, it's model and not model, that would be a way to do it. Model, not model. This would be fine. If you want to keep it by what's within and what's between, then if it has a repeated measure component, we're going to split it by within and between first. The only between source here are the differences between people, because we have multiple measurements for them. And then the 2 within sources are model and true error. Questions at all about that? Yeah, Fred.
If there's like a within component that should just set off a bunch of red flags, and we shouldn't be partition the other variance where it's like just your model and error, you have to split. Right?
Yeah, by within and between. Yeah. Yep. Unless you wanted, like I said, unless you wanted to think of this error as having like 2 parts. Subject differences and like real error, like actual unexplained error. And you wanted to be like, this is just residuals. It's left over from our model. If you wanted to keep it consistent, you could do it that way. Cool. All right. Questions? Can you see me? Can you see me? Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Like, where am I? I was waiting for it to pan to me. Questions up, ready for mixed or mixed? Mixed. There we go, mixed. Mixed, same thing. It's got a repeated measure component. So we're gonna break it down into within and between. But now, both within and between have different things. There's more than one within source and there's more than one between source. The other way you could do it, if you start to get lost in the flow chart, you might annotate the model first. So you might be like, based on my study design, source is, what did I say source is? Let's say between, valence is, I think actually the other way around, right? Doesn't matter for this particular example. So source is within, valence is between, source and valence is always within. And then error is that same thing where it's really left over from the model. And we've got subject, which is between, and true unsystematic error, which is within. If you want to do it flowchart way, we start with all of the variance in performance, so everything that explains performance. And we say some of the sources are between person, some of the sources are within person. And we can say between person, differences in performance are either caused by variable A, as in like what group, what level of variable A you are, or by stable differences between you and other people that we can see because we have multiple measures. And then our within, now we have good within and bad within. We have true error, there's our true unexplained variance error, and our model, which has the repeated measure variable and the interaction. Enter AJ's question. With more sources of explained variance in the mixed factorial ANOVA, can we say that it's more powerful than a repeated measures ANOVA? No, you can't compare apples to oranges because you don't actually know how big those slices of the pie are. So I draw them similarly because I copy paste variance circles. But you could have a mixed factorial with a ton of error and a repeated measures ANOVA with a very tiny amount of error where all the variance is explained by treatment. Where you can compare, here's where you can compare. You can compare, going back to the very beginning of the slide deck, you can compare these to each other, and you can compare these to each other. So if you change nothing about the variables, the number in each condition, how you measured it, essentially the only thing you changed was, in this example, you used a repeated measures design instead of a one-way. The repeated measure would have more power than the one-way. Similarly, if you changed nothing but making feedback source repeated measure instead, the mixed factorial would have more power than the factorial. But you can't compare feedback source, like you can't compare a mixed factorial to a one-way because you have no idea how much each variable is actually explaining your outcome. Does that clarify, AJ? What's the other type of ANOVA that gives you a power boost, like a mixed, bless you, like a mixed factorial and a repeated measure? Good. They all do a similar thing, which is they reduce that error term. Some of the unexplained sources of variance become explainable. That's it. Cool. Questions about that?
I think I missed, what was the question and what was the other one thing that increases power? And I just,
Ankova.
thank you.
Yeah, they all, although slightly different from these two, they all have a benefit of taking what was previously unexplainable and making it somewhat explained, like making it a systematic source of variance, which was previously unsystematic. There are lots of questions about assumptions. 14 of them. There's one question that got asked several times, and it's in the question section of the deck, so I'm not going to answer it now. I once again sort of gave you a summary slide. The good news is there's nothing on here that is like, what is X? We're asking like very specific filler questions now, which is great. I'm just going to clarify. Someone asked about like, it says the acceptable range of skew of kurtosis is -2 and 2. Again, like there isn't a rule. And it's all dependent on why your data is or isn't normal. I know that I never give you satisfactory answers on assumptions. I'm sorry, but it's because it really depends on why the data doesn't meet the assumption. It's important to know what the assumption is and why it matters in the context of ANOVA, but not necessarily like a cutoff rule or how to handle it, because I can't tell you how to handle it. If you brought your data to me and said, what do I do with this? I would say, show me your raw data, draw me some histograms. I need to figure out why it looks like that. So I'm not gonna ask you that type of thing because that only comes with practice with your data. So as you're running DAs, that's the type of thing you should be doing in terms of looking at, oh shoot, Levine's is violated. Why? And what might I want to do if this were my actual research study? I will tell you that for my data, I generally use a lower cutoff for skew and kurtosis, and here 3 and 10 is fine. Like I've said, 3 and 10 is fine. I have not taught you anything about handling a box violation at all. In fact, like I said, most people don't pay a lot of attention to box because it's very, very, very sensitive. I'm not going to ask you, therefore, about it. And then I really like this question about, do I have to check things again? And that will come up when we get to the questions. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Yes. Ask me what you want to ask me about assumptions.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
down here, you've reported Mockley's test, W equals, and I know a lot of times it's chi-squared. Does it matter which way we report it?
Don't care. Do you care? I don't care. Do you care? Quinn, do you care? Quinn doesn't care.
Those two different ways.
Yeah, know that, here's what I care that you know. It's called Mockley's W, that's the stat. What distribution does it follow?
Chi-squared.
Chi-square. I've seen it reported both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds like a dumb question.
nope, no such thing.
Does Levine's test always have 4 degrees of freedom?
No. Good, why? That's a great question. That's not a dumb question at all. Does Levine's test always have the first? So Levine's has, I do tend to write it with 2. So Levine's test is an F and it's got 2 degrees of freedom. Where does this first one come from? Number of levels. So if you're running a one-way ANOVA and it's got 3 levels, then that's gonna be a 2. But if I've got 4 levels, then that's gonna be a 3. That makes sense? Yeah?
It always has 2 numbers.
Oh, 2 numbers? Yeah, I thought you meant a 2, like literally a 2. 2 numbers. Yes, why? The participants. So two answers to that question. Why does it always have 2 degrees of freedom? It has 2 degrees of freedom. You can give 2 kind of answers to that. One is because it actually has 2 different degrees of freedom. It has the group between group degrees of freedom, but then it also has within each of those. But then what's the very simple answer to that question? What does Levine follow? F's distribution, which has 2 degrees of freedom. Yeah, but it's because there's a between, just like in an F for an ANOVA, there's a between and a within component of what you're assessing. If you think about what Levine's, the bigger thing is what is Levine's testing? So if you think about a one-way ANOVA, you've got, let's say, 50 people here, 50 people here, and 50 people here. There is a distribution of those 50 people, and they have a mean. There's a distribution of these 50 people, and they have a mean. And then there's a distribution of these 50 people, which is a little wider, and they have a mean. What Levine's is testing is whether this spread and this spread and this spread are significantly different from one another. So the first question it has to make sure is, well, how many people go into that spread? That is that degrees of freedom. But then it also needs to figure how many groups, how many distributions am I actually comparing? Am I comparing 3, or is there actually like a 4th? And that's that. Make sense? So it's the between and the within, just like in an F stat. Cool. Sphericity would be really similar, except would it be spreads of the outcome in each group? It would be like that distribution and then that distribution, and it would get really messy. Yeah.
For a question about the Moxley's test, where do you get the degree? Because it doesn't show now.
Yeah, it's a really pain in the butt. That's why I think I put W, because I was like, don't worry about it, just Mockley's W.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can show you later. Yeah,
I was trying to figure out for the, I don't know how to do it.
yeah. Did you ask ChatGPT?
No.
Try that. What'd you say?
Oh,
Or I taught you how to do it. Thanks, Kira. Not me. There's a formula in one of my slides. I told you that's where my brain is. Good. Other assumption questions, and I promise I'll entertain them instead of telling you it depends.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was good. That gave some like good conceptual stuff too. Yeah.
So when reporting the assumptions, do we do it for both simple effects and pairwise comparisons?
Yeah, so we're getting there. There's an explicit question about that. The short answer is yes. Just because your date, think about it. If you're running an Anova on 100 people and you check normality and it looks pretty good. And then you subset. And when you subset, one of the levels has like 15 people in it and all of a sudden it looks like this. The bottom line, I think like the other thing I want to get at with that question though is like, rather than thinking about, do I do this, yes or no? It's a mindset shift of like, I would never run a test of any kind without making sure the data I'm gonna run it on is appropriate for that. So if it's a new test on new data that you haven't yet investigated that set, then always check those assumptions again. Yeah,
This might be a little in the weeds, but
totally.
what
Fine.
happens if you are doing your subset and then you find like a extreme outlier in that subset?
Good question. How do I handle that? Let me think. It depends. What do you want to do with it?
Like, can you remove it at that point?
Yes, but
And then
if you remove it, what do you have to do?
You have to go all the way back.
Start over.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, you cannot, good question. So that is actually like a really great question, because that's the kind of stuff that happens when you're really analyzing your data. You're like 12 steps into your analysis, and then you're like, shit, that one thing, I really want to take that out. And if I take that out, then this actually works fine. But then all of this other assumption checking that I just ran up here in the Anova that I did, that I already wrote up in my manuscript and made tables for, I gotta do it again. That's what happens. It's called research. Yeah. For those of you who are like, and that's why I don't want to do a PhD. Yes, go ahead.
For variance and colon, when we have.
For ANCOVA? Oh, I don't think I put, good, what did I think it's in the midterm deck, but not on this one. I think I didn't add ANCOVA on this. This also brings up another really good point, and I'm gonna give you a vulnerable moment here. You ready? This is like a vulnerable, real statistician moment. Actually said to me yesterday, I have to look up assumptions every time I run something, right? Not ones that apply across the board. I know that the general linear model needs normality. I know what types of charts I'm gonna look at to examine what my data looks like. But to make sure I've T'd and I'd everything, you look it up all the time. So the reason I'm saying that is because I'm like, which version of homoscedasticity goes with ANCOVA now? And I don't run ANCOVAs. Do you know? Come on, social. ANCOVA? Allison's like, no. I think, I mean, what? Who's
No one
that?
is doing ANCOVAs.
Was that Deja?
It's got to
Oh,
be.
Deja. Oh, like, where's the bell from? It's Deja. Yeah, I mean, you're sad, so. But yes, it would still be, and this should really honestly, these are all homogeneity of variance versions, Kayla, like these three. But if we were to add like an even more umbrella, you could call it homoscedasticity. And these would all be three flavors of that.
For the assumption for ANOVA, you can think of it as you're checking two set of assumptions. You're checking one for the ANOVA and you're checking one for the covariate. So you would do the same, you would still check no matter, no?
No, don't think about assumptions as belonging to a variable. Think of assumptions as belonging to your data. They are assumptions that are being made by the test you're they're assumptions about your data, the structure of and distribution of your data. Not about a particular variable. And they're made by the analysis you're running, not by you. That's an important thing to understand. You're not making any assumptions. In fact, you're doing the opposite. You're like investigating the you know what out of your data. It's the analysis that's making the assumption. Yeah.
What would you say is the most common misunderstanding about assumptions, either like by us, this class in particular, or in general through the question?
That they're like rule-based. I'm gonna ask TAs that question. I don't know how to phrase that. But the idea that they're like either yes, no, or that there's like a if violated do X versus that it's linear and logical. That's the way to say it. That it's like I check, it violated, I do this. Not like a super circular, like, oh, it's this data point, and then it makes it a little less normal or a little more normal, but then I have this issue with this group, and then this group like throws that group, and then like it's so much messier than. But if I gave you a data set where the focus was messy assumption stuff and messy data structure at the point of learning where we are now, we would never learn any analysis because you could spend the whole module like basically data wrangling is what we're talking about. So I've always had this struggle and I'm totally open to feedback on it. I've had the struggle of like, do I just cut assumptions completely out of Anova? She's like, no, don't do that. But I get why people like, especially people who are learning oriented, you want to like dig deeper into it. I get it. I'm the same way, but I'm trying to like keep you above the rabbit hole. Do you know what I mean? So that we like don't lose sight of Anova. But I don't want to not teach it to you because they are important, but your ability to really handle them at a sophisticated level doesn't come until your kind of general stats foundation is really solid. So put a pin in that. And then after the final, give me all the feedback because it's going to come up in C2. Now, as you get better, you're going to feel more comfortable making your own decisions about what to do. But, and the DAs are going to look different, but yeah. What did he say? What did he say? Yeah, say whatever he said because he's not here.
It's not related to the question Em just asked, but I was like, why did we run assumption test for simple effect for mixed factorial, but not for factorial?
We do if it's we should. It depends on how the data it depends on like how the data gets sliced. Does that make sense?
No.
It's follow up with me.
Yeah.
It depends. Here's why. If you're checking like Levine's in a factorial, you've checked all 9 conditions. Let's say it's a 3x3. So you've already checked all 9 against each other. Whereas if you split, sphericity is only checking the marginal means of the repeated measure variable. But when you get to let's say you parsed it out by the between, now you've got 3 sphericities to check. That makes sense? If everyone's like, what the heck did she just say? I'm happy to draw for you on the board, but it's not the most important thing. Promise. Can I keep going? No, Victor, what? I'm just kidding. What? Go ahead.
Will we be dealing at some point today with what happens when one of the 3 homogeneity variants?
What do you think? You are so smart. Do you think that I'm gonna write something on the test that says, what do you do if one of the 3 Levines is violated?
Well, you did it on the DA, so I'm assuming.
Oh, did I?
Yeah.
Ouch. Answered. I don't know. Well, the difference is you have the data on the DA.
Yeah.
You have the data.
Yeah.
I can't give you the raw data on the test.
Maybe my question isn't clear.
Fine, the answer is no. What the hell? No. No, yeah. No. I'm actually just gonna give you this grid blank. You have to fill in the whole thing, and that's the whole test. I mean, let me tell you something, if I gave you this as a cheat sheet, it wouldn't help you on the final. Cause this is not ANOVA, these are assumptions that belong to the general linear model, no matter what. They're flavored for ANOVA, but they're not ANOVA. So you might get a couple points out of this as a cheat sheet, but you definitely won't be enough. As in, this is not the focus of ANOVA. Where are we? Follow-up testing, and then we're gonna take a break. No, we're gonna take a break now, because my brain needs a break after that. It's 10:15, but come back at 10:20, we got a lot left. I'm serious, it's a dilemma I can't solve.
I thought it was great.
How you feeling? Yes, I get that. How was it? Really?
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about follow-up testing. Come on back. Come on back, come on back. Oh, so remember that ANOVA is sort of a big exercise in organizing your brain. It's not always hard, but it is always tedious. So I thought it would be helpful to condense all of the follow-up testing in one spot, which is something you could do for you, probably a good idea. If I were in your shoes, I'd probably try to create some visual like what's on the next page, and then compare it to what's on the next page to see how clear is it in your own brain. Because if you look at the next page, you're gonna go, yeah, that makes sense. That's like the understand level of Bloom's. We need, like, can you actually do it is different. So, but I am gonna show it to you, share it as a resource. So we're gonna do this like kind of popcorn rapid fire. You have a one-way ANOVA. You are looking to see whether you have a main effective A. If you have a main effective A, if you do not have a main effective A, what are you gonna do? Nothing. Report it. If you do have a main effective A on your outcome, I'm gonna say that now, and then you're gonna assume that I'm always gonna say on the outcome. But for the sake of review and not being here till 3, I may just say a main effective A. But consider the exam communication level, so we're always gonna say outcome. So if we have a main effective A, what are we gonna do? Post hoc, I need more. Post hoc pairwise comparisons using Tukey's procedure. Good. Great. Post hoc comparison using a Tukey's procedure to control for family-wise error. Tukey's is not a test. What tests are we doing when we run pairwise comparisons? T-test. What kind of T-test? Good. All right. There we go. That's all the follow-up needed. Yay. Repeated measures ANOVA. Main effective A. If we don't have one, what do? Stop, report it. If we do have a main effect, we want to see where those differences lie. What do? Post hoc pairwise comparison using Holmes to control for family-wise error rate. Good. That's it. Good. All right, now the fun ones. Factorial ANOVA. First effect of interest. First effects of interest. Do we have a main effective A? Do we have a main effective B? And do we have an interaction? If we have a main effective A, what are we gonna do? Post hocs, we can shorten it now. You don't have to say pairwise comparison. Post hocs using what? Good. Post hocs using Tukey's for both of these pairwise comparisons because they're both between variables. Then what are we gonna do for the interaction? Simple effects. We are either gonna do this simple effect of A at each on the outcome at each level of B, or the simple effect of B on the outcome at each level of A. How are we gonna do that? That's the setup. What's the analysis? Depending on how we split it, we're either gonna have 2 levels or 3 levels or 4 levels to deal with. 2 or more levels to deal with. So we're either gonna run some version of a t-test or some version of an ANOVA. What t-test, what ANOVA, and how do we do post hocs? So if it's a t-test, what type? Independent. If it's an ANOVA, what type? One way between groups. And what are we gonna post hoc? Tukey's procedure, good. So we're either gonna run independent t-tests for our simple effects, or if it's got more than 2 levels, then we've got to run a one-way between groups ANOVA, followed again by post hocs, again using Tukey. This is like the easiest one to keep track of compared to mixed factorial. I mean, obviously the first 2 are easier, but with an interaction. Mixed factorial, main effective A, main effective B, interaction. Now, we're gonna assume that the first one, A, is between groups and the second one is within groups. So for the main effective A, if we have one, we're gonna run what? Post hocs using what procedure to control for error? Tukey, good. Main effective B, same thing, but we're gonna use Holmes instead of Tukey. Interaction, simple effect of A, notice it's the exact same as a factorial. It's a simple effect of A at each level of B, or the simple effect of B at each level of A. Now, here's where it gets the trickiest, I think, of all, in terms of keeping things straight. What test? Totally depends. Not just, this only depends on levels, number of levels. That's what drives this. But this is driven by 2 things, not just number of levels, but also what?
Are you subsetting?
Are you subsetting by between or within? Good. So if we split by our between variable, meaning we have, let's say AM and PM again. So we have an AM data set and a PM data set. Then we're gonna run either a dependent t-test or an RM ANOVA with Holmes as our correction. What? Yeah, it's all flipped. It's no. Oh, sorry, what? If we split by the within, then what we're left over with is a between comparison, which means we're gonna run either an independent t-test if there's 2 levels, or a one-way ANOVA with Tukeys. Cool, question. Oh, I see, it's flipped. I get it. Yes, if you split between, you run within. If you split within, you run between. Yes.
Excuse me, yes.
Yes,
Can you make sure you're sharing your screen, please?
I am.
Thank you.
Can anyone else see it? Not you guys. Oh, you. Can anyone online see the screen? Oh, cool. Questions about this? We're gonna get to simple effects next slide. Yeah.
Clarify, when you say split by,
Yeah.
I was trying to visualize it, it's split by the variable that's on the.
You have no idea. Yes. So think about it like this. Think about it as your means table. So here's, you've got, let's say A and B splitting by, call this A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3. If I split by A, that would mean I'm splitting along the lines of A, and A is becoming its own data set, B, B, B. That makes sense? If I split by B, B is becoming its own data sets, and I'm looking at the effect of A at each level of B. Whatever I split by is the at each level of part, because we've split it into what? Each of the levels. So we start with a variable that has multiple levels and it's all in one data set. When I say subset or split by, what we're doing is we're taking that data and we're breaking it into separate data sets with just a single level in it. So if I'm saying like split by time of day, instead of one data set with AM and PM data, I'm saying this is just a data set with AM data and just a data set with PM data. We're splitting it apart into levels, and that's what allows us to look at the effect of one predictor on the outcome at a specific level of the other predictor. Yeah.
Why, if you split by within, do you run between?
Good. So let's say that this is, that A is within and B is between. If you split the data by the within, then the test you're running
Yeah.
is here. You're running it on between level.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's why I don't want us to play the memorization game. Because the memorization game will trip you up in ANOVA. 100%. You guys are you have gotten to a place where you know how to read a variable description and know whether something is within or between, like how it's measured. And I'm extra purposeful in the language about like trying to make it really clear if something is within or between, so that you don't have to play the memorization game. Otherwise, I think it can get really stuck. Yeah.
I've had a lot of questions in office hours about how to decide whether I'm going to subset my data by my.
Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So simple effects, office hours, and it's like 9 questions on the Qualtrics score. The effect of one predictor on the outcome at a specific level. So if we're looking, why do we do it? Why do we do simple effects?
Where the interaction.
Yeah, we call it probing the interaction. We know we have an interaction, but we don't know it's there. And big picture, main effects can be really misleading. I loved the example that we did on, is it Tuesday? No, it's Tuesday. It's Tuesday now. So the example we did on Thursday, where the main effect told us that pictures were like really distracting environments hurt recall. And if I had run a one-way ANOVA or repeated measures ANOVA that way, I would have walked out into the world and said, really distracting environments hurt recall. Why is that? Why was that misleading? That was only true in the afternoon. In the morning, recall took no hit. So the idea is oftentimes interactions make main effects like conditional. So it's like, here's what we found as a main effect, except guess what? That only applies at this level of time of day. That's why we do interactions. That's why sometimes the main effect becomes like not very relevant when we have an interaction. And sometimes being able to report, like from a storytelling perspective, sometimes being able to report what you think is an interesting main effect and then blow it up with an interaction is kind of fun. Like that. Like people are saying, hey, you should always work in a distraction-free zone. Well, if we only looked at distraction, our findings would support that. But guess what? If we look at the simple effects of distraction on recall in the morning, that doesn't hold. So you can like use that to your advantage in your storytelling also. So what's an example? The effect of team composition on motivation for extroverts, the effect of team composition on motivation for introverts. Now, simple effect decision-making. This is what Deja just brought up and what a lot of you brought up in the Qualtrics. How do you make a decision about how to subset the data? The first thing I'll say is if this is your research question, like really your research, like this is your thesis, and you subset the wrong way, I'm gonna say wrong way, an unhelpful way, you will very quickly realize that you subsetted in a way that doesn't answer the question you authentically have. So what I'm trying to get at is like the reason you're struggling with how to subset is because the question isn't currently authentically yours. Does that make sense? Like it's a DA and I get it. And that, so it's really more just of like a familiarity and depth of comfort with stats and modeling that takes time before you feel like you could be like, oh yeah, I'm going to subset it this way. So I'm going to show you a few examples, but like always, I want us to be very careful of adopting any rule, because what we're going to find is 9 times out of 10, it works one way, but then 1 time out of 10, it doesn't work that way. And you're going to come back and be like, but Jess said you split by the moderator. And I'm going to be like, I didn't say that. I said, usually you split by the moderator, but not always. So let's look at a couple. Let's build the skill instead of building the rule. Does that make sense? That said, I'm doing this because this is a really good familiarize yourself with methods and stats thing to learn, not because there's a question on the exam that says, which way should you subset the data? In the output, the data is subsetted for you. And it's about like, where can I get the information that I need to answer a question? You know the one that I did on Thursday? You know that was an authentic screw up on my part. You know how I did it both ways? That was authentic. Like, I subsetted it the first way, and then I was like, shit, that doesn't answer my question. Guess I better subset it the other way. Like, that's what will happen in real life. And it's not wrong. Or if you always want to cover your, you know what, subset it, subset it both ways. Be Raider, be like Raider, subset it both ways. Yeah, great.
They're not gonna ask for your R code.
So here are some factorial designs. I asked, I'm gonna tell you how I just asked ChatGPT, give me 4 factorial research questions in this form. I said, how does blank and blank impact blank? I do not want you to give me a model. I don't want you to use the word depends. I'm gonna figure that out. How do teaching method, lecture versus discussion, and class size, small versus large, affect student engagement? So I'm thinking about it, like, what is the phenomenon here? Am I looking at lecture classes and saying, here are all the lecture classes across CGU. Does the effectiveness of that depend on whether they're small or large? Or am I taking all the small classes at CGU and then saying, here are all the tiny classes, what works better? Lecture or discussion? I can make an argument for either. Yeah? So let's just pick one. What do you like? Class size? What do you mean? So does the impact of, let's start with research question. Does the impact of what on what depend on what? Does the impact of teaching method on engagement depend on size of the class? I like that. So method, engagement, size. Cool. Next question. Ready? How do gender, sex, and stereotype threat condition affect math test performance? This one feels much clearer to me. Stereotype threat to performance. But again, this is totally dependent on my research context. Like, maybe I'm a social psychologist who studied stereotype threat for a really long time, and now I want to know if it differs based on sex. Well, then this is a logical way to set it up. How do feedback type, positive, neutral, negative, and test difficulty, easy, hard, affect self-efficacy? So put yourself in the situation of getting feedback. Do you want to know whether the impact of feedback on let's call it self-esteem, for those of you who aren't familiar with self-efficacy, not the same, but we won't get into that. Does the effect of feedback on self-efficacy depend on how hard the task is? Or does the impact of task on self-efficacy depend on the valence of feedback?
First.
You like 2? I like 1.
First one.
You like 1?
Other thing, can you like choose justification for when you choose one over the other?
Sure. So here's the thing. If this were your research, you would write justification. What would that be? The entire front end of your manuscript. Like, you would be framing your hook around why the hell you decided to do this research. You would be like, for example, you'd be like, there's a lot of debate in the literature about the effect of feedback on confidence. We see praise really helps confidence, but negative feedback really takes a dip. But I wonder if people aren't thinking about, maybe it depends on the type of task people are engaged in. Well, guess what? I just set it up for you with task type as the moderator. Like, your framing is going to set up the model for you. So that's why I do it in the prompt, but you'll have pages if you were really doing a research study upon which to do that. So I'm going to do that because, and you know, what's interesting about you choosing 1 and me choosing 2 is I research feedback. So as an org psychologist, my instinct was to be like, well, I know a lot about how feedback impacts efficacy, but what are the boundary conditions of that? What if the task type changes? So my brain went there because that's what my brain does for research normally. So feedback type, efficacy, task difficulty. Now, I'm not going to do the 4th one, but I'm going to show you then now how I would split. Notice I can't decide how to split until I have framed the research question and the model correctly. Because how I split will either answer my question or not answer my question. So if I'm gonna start with, does the effective teaching method on engagement depend on size? Well, that means I want to get lecture and I want to get discussion and I want to see if the effectiveness of that on engagement depends on size. Let me do the next one. I want to know whether the effect of stereotype threat on performance depends on sex of the student taking the test. So I want to look at the situation where stereotype threat is present and see if performance happens differently based on sex. And then in the control or absent condition, same thing. And then in this last one, feedback. Does the effective feedback on efficacy depend on task type? Well, I know that usually praise or positive feedback has a really great impact on self-efficacy. But do I see differences depending on whether the task is easy versus hard? What's the same about all of these? I didn't split by my moderator. I split by the not moderator. They're both, I don't want to say predictor because they're both predictors. But I split by that main effect predictor so that I could examine depends of the moderator, because that's what a moderator is. It says, hey, because guess what? When we build a model, this is actually how we build it. We say, all right, here's the impact of feedback on efficacy. What's that called? What kind of effect is that? It's a main effect or direct main effect. It's a main effect. It's the effect of feedback on efficacy, ignoring everything else. We test this first. Even when we're in regression land, we test this first. And then we say, I wonder if that depends, i.e., if that relationship changes based on level of task difficulty, hence the definition of a simple effect. So we're always going to, or almost always, in a between group design, when both are between group, we're going to split by this so we can investigate whether things truly depend on our moderator. Does that help clarify for a factorial? Don't worry, mixed is next, because it's less straightforward. Good? Not good? Bueller? Yes? Helpful? No? We're still unclear? Anyone?
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool. Awesome.
We just do it the way,
What?
we just do it the way, just.
Yeah, exactly. Just do it the other way. Just do both ways. Now, watch this. This is kind of trippy. It's tripping up in the example on Tuesday. All right. This is a mixed design. How do therapy type, CBT versus psychoanalysis, and time, pre, mid, post, affect anxiety level? Now, how am I going to draw the model here? It's actually easier to draw the model. Go ahead, Em.
Therapy type to anxiety level.
I'm going to try that first. Hold on. Therapy type. Read that out loud.
How does therapy type affect anxiety depending on time?
Do you like it? It's not bad. It could be fine. It depends, again, on what the interest of the researcher is. What's the other way we could write it?
How does that affect the time on anxiety depend on
This time.
So like time is like a,
But would you really write time?
yeah, no, it's what is it like?
What would you write?
The difference before, during and after the treatment.
Yeah, I would probably write treatment or intervention. The intervention is operationalized as before it, during it, after it. That's really common. For stats, we often say time, because repeated measures is really common to do like pre, post, post, but we're not actually measuring time. We're measuring time relative to the intervention. So if you see time, really, it's not random time like Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday. It's time in relationship to some sort, usually, of intervention. So it's in your theoretical model Remember, your theoretical model is not your stats model, it's your model of answering the research question. So it's in your theoretical model to say, I think that the intervention's effect on anxiety depends on the type that was used. Meaning, how did people who use CBT, how did their anxiety change over time compared to how did people who use psychoanalysis change over time? Let's look at the next one. How do study environment, quiet versus noisy, and test session, morning versus afternoon versus evening, affect memory recall? So let's say here that we didn't even decide which one's repeated measure. Probably quiet versus noisy. I don't know. This would be an experiment.
So wouldn't it be an examining option?
You're gonna have to take the test 3 times.
Yeah, you're gonna have to take the test 3 times. That sucks. I don't like that one. Let's do this. It's a bad research question. Bad research assigned. All right. How do advertising type? I want to do one that's not time. How do advertising type, emotional versus factual, and purchase stage, initial exposure, decision making, and it's kind of time, and post-purchase evaluation affect consumer attitudes? So what's the model? Advertising what?
Advertising type on consumer attitudes.
Depend on what? So does ad type attitudes depend on, oops, not the word depends, depend on stage? Remember that your model is an answer to your research question. What is your research question here?
What's there, when the consumer at what stage at, which ad you should use. So
Ooh.
it should be switched.
Yeah. Good, say that louder. Ask the research question. So what you're starting with, which I like, is a phenomenon. So what she said was, what you're noticing is that different types of ads might work, like are working better or more poorly, depending on where customers are in their experience. So what you're wondering is, do different types of ads work better or worse at different stages? So what would answer that question? Is it stage on attitudes moderated by ad type, or ad type on attitudes moderated by stage? So we have option 1, option A, and then option B would be stage attitudes moderated by type.
Option B.
Option B. If what you really want to know is the context you just gave. Again, see how incredibly tied to context it is? Now, let's look at the simple effect part, because now we have a different phenomenon. How did we end up doing it in a factorial? We split by what? No. We split by the main effect so we can examine differences amongst level of the moderator. Good. However,
Consumer attitudes.
not anxiety. I'm sure it causes anxiety.
Depends on the purchase.
By anxiety.
Yeah, depends on what you're buying. But now, in these mixed ones, which ones are a repeated measure? This one, that's a within subject variable. And this one. So if we were to apply the same rule we used in factorial, we should split by, let's look at this first one. We should split by intervention time and be like pre, mid, post. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis. CBT, psychoanalysis. CBT, psychoanalysis. Is that helpful? No. Why? What question does that boxed thing allow us to answer? Before they do any therapy, I wonder if there's a difference between the people I'm going to randomly assign to one of those two conditions. So that rule doesn't work in a mixed factorial. In a mixed factorial, we have to split by the between subject variable. So we can, especially when when the repeated measure is time, so we can see change over time. So in this case, no matter how we draw the model, it doesn't matter, because we're going to be able to see how did anxiety change over time based on which therapy people had. It's almost because the depends language doesn't quite apply in a mixed factorial. What's your actual question here? Don't overthink. What do you really want to know from this study?
Which one is more effective?
Which therapy is better?